I'd like to introduce our speaker, Josh Scullin. He is the Land Bird Program Director for SFBBO. Josh has a bachelor's in wildlife management from West Virginia University, and he's also a North American Banding Council certified trainer. So a lot of experience banding birds, of course. He spent several years doing fieldwork all across North America, including Hawaii and also Central America too. He has been here with SFBBO for over 10 years. He's been managing our Coyote Creek Field Station. So we're really excited to hear what he has to say about that. So go ahead and hand it over to Josh.
All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in to this birdie hour here. I'm Josh Scullin, the Land Bird Program Director at SFBBO and the Coyote Creek Field Station Manager. Tonight I'll be giving you a little bit of an introduction to bird banding, and I'll be talking about bird banding in a broader sense, but then also specifically in the context of the Coyote Creek Field Station, which I'll refer to periodically as CCFS throughout this presentation. I'll also take a few detours along the way to touch on some other SFBBO banding projects. So even though we mostly deal with land birds at the Coyote Creek Field Station, don't be surprised if you see a few non-land birds making an appearance in here. So to start with, just in a bigger sense, what is bird banding? So bird banding is the scientific methodology of attaching uniquely marked tags to track individuals or a population of birds. There's all sorts of applications with modern bird banding, including the western snowy plover pictured here. You can see two small color bands on each of its legs, and that helps us to identify that individual bird based on that color combination. But we'll come back to that a little bit later on in the presentation. First, we're going to take a step back through history and see how all of this got started. So we're going to go kind of a ways back. The earliest evidence of domesticating birds is as far back as 3000 BCE. But it wasn't until about 200 BCE that there's documented use of birds as messengers, as carrier pigeons. The top mosaic on this slide shows an Egyptian columbarium, and columba is Latin for pigeon. So it's basically just a pigeon house, just a place that people kept all of their birds. And they would use them to transmit messages back and forth. Julius Caesar, I think in the 6th century, would use messenger pigeons to send communications back and forth to different parts of his realm. And going forward a little bit farther in time, just keeping the track of messenger pigeons. Messenger pigeons were heavily used during World War I and World War II. In World War I, several countries employed them, including the Swiss Army Carrier Pigeon Service and the US Army Signal Corps. The US Army Signal Corps had over 1,500 pigeons employed in France, and armies would use them to send important messages back and forth from the different active war zones. In World War I, pigeons were also carried aboard aircraft that were out on patrol. And if the servicemen on the aircraft had to send a message back to headquarters, they would scribble it down, attach it to one of their pigeons, and toss the pigeon out of the plane. And that sounds really dangerous, but they actually had a 95% return rate for all the pigeons that they let go. They ended up going back to headquarters to deliver the message. So it was really effective means of communications. And in World War II, the British Army Pigeon Service had over 250,000 pigeons for military purposes, including with communicating with spies behind enemy lines. So birds in general, pigeons in particular, have served quite an important role throughout our history. But military uses aren't the only areas of communication transmission that we've used pigeons for. And I'll give you about 20 seconds to read through this slide. So this article was published on the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers website, or the IEEE. And keen-eyed readers might have noticed that this article was published on April Fool's Day. And so while mostly it's written in a tongue-in-cheek manner, it's actually grounded in reality. 10 years prior, in 2009, a company in South Africa sent a 4 gigabyte USB drive via carrier pigeon, kind of as a statement to highlight just how poorly their ground-based, their internet, conventional internet data transfer speeds were. The pigeon arrived with its 4 gigabyte payload in 2 hours. And at that point, only 4% of the 4 gigabytes had transferred over the internet to their destination. So it was a really good way to show like just how slow and just how poor the infrastructure was, to the point where the pigeon was just incredibly, like just so much faster at transferring data than going on the internet and sending an email. And the authors of a 2019 study, well, I say study, they calculated the weight of 1 terabyte micro SD cards to determine a maximum payload that a pigeon could carry. And they found that carrier pigeon data transfer rates were up to 28 gigabits per second, which is 28,000 megabits per second, versus the modern average internet speed of 100 megabits per second. So pigeons are 280 times faster at transferring data compared to current global internet speeds. So it may not be exactly practical to attach a bunch of micro SD cards to a pigeon and send it out on its way. But it's interesting, just an interesting note for modern times. But getting back to some historical context, there are a few other examples that help frame modern banding efforts. So back in 1595, a peregrine falcon, which was owned by Henry IV of France, ended up flying all the way down and being recovered in Malta. So that's well over 1,000 miles away from Paris, significantly farther than the distance between San Diego and Seattle. So that bird made a huge journey, and it's one of the earliest recorded recaptures, essentially, from that kind of distance. In the early 1700s, there were 2 recoveries of gray herons that were banded. One in 1710, which was recovered 1,200 miles from its original banding location in Turkey. And then one in 1728, when a gray heron was observed 59 years after its original banding in 1669. So even though banding back then wasn't really standardized, there was no scientific purpose for it, it was mostly to track ownership of birds, it's still starting to show some of the purposes that banding birds can have. And then jump ahead a century, in 1803, we've got the first banding records in North America by John James Audubon. He banded a nest of eastern phoebes in his backyard, and the following year, 2 birds that had a little bit of silver thread that he had attached to them came back. And so he was able to see that all of the birds that he's seeing in his yard, it seems likely that some of them are the same individuals from year after year. So this kind of addresses, or at least gives us the tools to address some bigger questions like, how far do birds travel? And how long do birds live? And do individuals come back to the same location year after year? So we'll jump ahead another century here. In the early 1900s, this is when scientific banding really started being introduced to North America. In 1902, the Smithsonian Institute started banding black-crowned night herons with bands that were stamped with a serial number and a message that said, "Please return to the Smithsonian Institution." And this kind of laid the groundwork for our modern recapture reporting system. We have a very similar serial number stamped on a band. For the longest time, the bands would say, "Write Washington, D.C." And you could drop a band in a mail and just put "Wash, D.C." on the envelope, no postage even necessary, drop it in a mailbox, and it would get to the bird banding lab. And then in 1909, the American Bird Banding Association was formed by an ornithologist at University of Wisconsin. And they started to standardize some of the banding practices that were being employed at the time. And then just a few years later, in 1920, the US Bureau of Biological Survey took over from the American Bird Banding Association and began administering national banding efforts. And pictured in this photo is Frederick C. Lincoln, who led that organization for about 26 years, just from 1920 and on, and did an incredible amount of work standardizing and modernizing bird banding practices. And he established a lot of the structures that we actually still follow today. All of the serial numbers, all of the band numbers are basically still following the systems that they set up back then. So we have a little bit of information now about how bird banding started. So how do we actually do it? So here's some examples of some of our banding tools. We've got calipers for very fine millimeter measurements on birds. And then we've got a couple other rulers to measure the wing and the tail. And then we have banding pliers, which allow us to apply the bands. And the bands themselves come in a variety of different sizes. There's over 20 different sizes to fit, large and small birds. And they all have unique 9-digit numbers stamped on them. And that's a continuation of Frederick C. Lincoln's system. At the banding station at CCFS, we typically just use the 8 smallest sizes. And what's kind of amazing about the band number system is none of the numbers are repeated across any of the different sizes. So even though you'd think like a really large band for an eagle could have the same band number as a really tiny band for a kinglet, they actually don't overlap those band numbers at all. So as you can see from these photos, the bands come closed. So we also need a means of opening them to fit onto the bird's leg. So we do that with these specialized banding pliers. And instead of having 2 different tools, we can actually just have one tool that has a small little set of pins, which you can see in the photo, that we slide the band onto. And as we open the pliers up, that very gently spreads the band out. And then when we take the band off, we can put it in one of the 2 holes at the top of the pliers to then be able to fit it onto the leg of the bird, apply a little bit of pressure, and make sure that band is closed around the leg. We'll always measure the leg before we apply the band to make sure that the band isn't going to be too small, it's not going to be too large before we put it on. So now we've got how we put the band on the bird, but how did we get the bird in the hand to begin with? So at the field station at CCFS, we have a few different arrays of mist nets. Mist nets are 2 meters tall and 12 meters long, and they're made of a very, very fine mesh. They have 4 different tiers so that when a bird hits the net, it'll fall into one of those 4 pockets. And here you can see the net somewhat well, kind of running down the middle of the photo. Closer to us, where there's vegetation, it's a little harder to see the mesh. But farther out, where you can see there's more light coming in from the background, it's easier to see those nets. So when we open the nets, we'll open them 30 minutes before sunrise when it's still dark, and we'll keep the nets open for 5 hours. If we need to close the nets because of inclement weather, or if we need to delay opening because it's too cold, then we'll do that, and we'll just adjust the amount of time that we have the nets open. And so these nets are relatively visible in this picture, but in ideal conditions, it should look a little bit more like this. So you can see a pole on the left side of this picture, and there's 2 black hoops that are wrapped around the pole, one at the top and one much closer to the bottom. And from those, a large panel of mist net extends out into the vegetation. And so it's a much more sheltered environment. It's a much better condition for mist netting, because if we can't see the mist net from here, birds can't see the mist net from here either. So when a bird flies into the net, it ends up getting tangled in that fine mesh that the net is made of. So in this case, this is a Wilson's warbler, and it's got its head poke through one of those squares of the net, and you can see its feet are kind of grabbing on to little clusters of the net. Birds have recurved claws. Uh-oh, my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully you're still hearing me. The birds have recurved claws so that they'll grab onto the net while we're extracting them. And so the manner that we're trying to extract them is we'll leave the feet towards the end. So we'll grab onto the bird in a way that allows us access to the wings and to the head, and mostly leaves the feet towards the end of the extraction. And so this shows a yellow warbler in what we call a body grab grip, where we generally have a handle on the bulk of the bird's body cavity. And then as we extract the bird, we'll remove the net from the wings and from the head, and to the point where it's just left around the feet. And here you can see how those claws kind of curve back onto themselves. And the net just takes a little bit of finesse and a little bit of massaging to work it out from those toes. I should take a second here to point out that handling wild birds is safe with the appropriate training. We spend a lot of time at CCFS training our volunteers to make sure they're handling birds safely and in a professional manner. Training volunteers at CCFS can take upwards of 3 to 5 years, and all of our protocols are standardized, which they're all designed with bird safety in mind. And it can look a little, this grip in this picture is called the Bander's grip. It can look a little scary to somebody who's never seen a bird in the hand before, but it's completely safe to do with the appropriate training. All right, so now we have how we ban birds and how we catch them. So let's talk a little bit about where we catch them. So here we have the Central Valley, or not the Central Valley, sorry, Central Coastal California. And we are in the South Bay, just at the little end of the boot there. And if we zoom in, there is a small section of riparian habitat outlined in yellow in the very center of that zoomed in yellow box. That's where our banding station is. And we're going to go back a little bit in time again to 1939. So this is an aerial map, an aerial image of this specific area of where the field station is. That outlined yellow box is where we are currently located. And the Coyote Creek is the black line that just kind of curves down the middle of that box. And you can see that, that this area where CCFS is now, in 1939 was entirely surrounded by agriculture. You can also see up to the northwest in the upper left part of the screen, all that dark green, well, it's dark green, but all that darker habitat is tidal marsh. And so there was a lot more back in 1939 compared to, if we fast forward 50 years later, 1993, the yellow square is in the same location. The Coyote Creek is in the same location, but you can see just how different the surrounding area looks. All of that tidal marsh up in the upper left is now salt production ponds. Immediately adjacent to the west of the field station, those are all ponds for wastewater control, water pollution control. And then to the east of the field station, there's a long line that cuts down the photo, that's 880. And everything to the east of that is all residential and some industrial development. And that was all agriculture 50 years prior. Just surrounding the station, like immediately to the east and then south of where we are, there's still a lot of open agricultural lands. But if we jump ahead 25 years to March 2019, we can see now a lot of that habitat has been developed. The McCarthy Ranch, the shopping center is all immediately to the east of the field station, and a lot of industrial buildings have been put in to the south of us. A lot of businesses now make their home in Silicon Valley. And so the McCarthy family, they were the farmers that managed all of these lands for generations. And over the past several decades, they've been slowly parceling off their land to all of this development. But they did donate all of the riparian corridor along the Coyote Creek. All of it that's left right now was donated to the city of San Jose by the McCarthy family. So here we have a bit of a zoomed in image of the field station itself. And I'll go through and point out some of the features of it. The Coyote Creek is barely visible. It just snakes around to the right of the vegetation there. There is a strip of remnant riparian woodland, which was actually visible in the 1939 aerial imagery. So that riparian forest is over 80 years old, probably a lot older than that, if they had it around while they were still farming. And then in 1987, the Water District implemented a restoration effort to expand the amount of riparian woodland that was available in this area. And they followed up in 1993 with another restoration on the other side of that open channel, which is designed to be an overflow channel. So these restorations that they put in were kind of a mitigation for flood control projects that they were implementing in other parts of San Jose. In the early 80s, there were some fairly economically damaging floods that damaged Alviso quite a bit. And at that point, San Jose said, we need a way to mitigate for this. We need a way to control these floods so this damage doesn't happen in the future. And so the Water District, with the help of some local consulting firms, designed a series of levees that would allow the floodwaters to pass through during periods of substantial storms. And so back in 2017, when the Anderson Dam broke, there was a section of the levee down in central San Jose that was breached. I guess I shouldn't say that the dam broke, it was overflowed, it overspilled its capacity. There's a section in central San Jose that breached, and there are a couple apartment complexes that got flooded out. But in the northern section of San Jose, all of these levees, which were put in the 80s and 90s, they kept all of that water contained. There's probably a solid 8 feet of water in that overflow channel in the middle. And in an average year, we'll see like maybe 2 to 3 feet of water, 4 on the upper end of what we're used to dealing with. So it was a fairly substantial amount of water that passed through. And all of these lines indicate where all of our nets are. So they're broken down into 3 groups: Saturday, Wednesday, and Sunday, and we just name them after the days that we operate them. So the Saturday nets will go out on a Saturday, and we'll set up, well, all the nets are already there, so we'll open 14 nets in those white lines. And on Wednesdays, we'll go across and we'll open those 14 and a half nets. Now you say, wait, half a net. So a half a net is actually a 6-meter net, because we count one net as a full 12-meter net. So that's why we've got 14 and a half there. And then on Sunday, we have 19 nets. So all those orange marks are where we are working on Sundays. And each day that we're out banding, we have nets spread across in each of the 4 different habitat types. So over the course of 1 week, we run 12 nets in each of the different habitats. So now we have how and where, and let's move on to why. So admittedly, we don't catch burrowing owls at CCFS, but they are a really great example of why banding is important. SFBBO partners with Deborah Krumzak and some other owl researchers in the South Bay to provide administrative support for their banding efforts. So what we can get with population like burrowing owls, they've been declining for over the past few decades with all of that development, the conversion of the agricultural lands that we saw even as recent as 1993 into urban and industrial areas. And so by banding the remaining owl populations, we can start to look at their population structure and demographics. So we can look at things like age and sex ratios. We can look to see, are there more of adults, more of juveniles, more of males, more of females, And we can look at survival to see which birds are doing well and which birds are struggling. And you can pair those together and say, are there any factors that are causing juvenile birds to not survive as well as the adults? And that's something that they've been finding is with the decrease in prey availability, there's not as much food to feed the younger birds. And so the juvenile birds are having a harder time surviving over the years. And that's one factor leading to their continued population declines. And with a small enough population and with enough birds banded, you can actually look at family trees. You can document which birds mated and which offspring they produced, and you can correlate the parents to the offspring. And you can see if there are any instances of inbreeding, which is a very common thing when you get a very small population of birds. So some other whys of bird banding. There's some behavioral aspects that we can look at. So we can look at things like site fidelity, which is, does an individual bird come back to the same location year after year? There's territoriality. If we catch one bird in the same net, multiple times throughout the breeding season, we can be pretty sure that's where its territory is. There are certain species that flock together during certain times of the year. And so we can actually look at a little bit of social interactions between individual birds. So if we see the same 2 or 3 or 10 individual birds getting caught in the same nets at the same time, we know that they're sticking together over the course of, say, a winter period. And then we can also look at dispersal and see where are birds going once they're, say, done with the breeding season. And so for the song sparrow, which is the bird pictured on the left here, something we found was that younger birds tend to get pushed into the poorer quality vegetation, poorer quality habitat, once they're no longer dependent on their adults to feed them. And for what we're considering the poorer quality habitat is the overflow channel, which the Water District maintains as pretty much just a weedy field. And the adults, once they no longer have to take care of their juveniles, they're young for that year, basically go back to doing what they were doing before, and they treat their offspring as competitive, as potential competitors. So they'll chase them away and they'll keep their own territory and all of their resources to themselves. And on the right there is a common yellowthroat. And common yellowthroats are kind of interesting as they are present at CCFS from March to August, so mostly the breeding season, but not during the winter. They disappear in September and don't show back up again until the following March. And the common yellowthroats are supposed to be resident year-round in the Bay Area, so we would expect them to behave similarly to song sparrows, which are also resident, that we catch, summer, spring, fall migration, and throughout the winter. But the yellowthroats disappear. And so that leaves us a big question mark of where are they going? And that has a little bit of conservation implication because there are 2 subspecies of common yellowthroat that occupy the Bay Area. One is the San Francisco yellowthroat, which predominantly lives within a few miles of tidal marsh habitat in the Bay. And the other is what we just call the upland common yellowthroat, which doesn't occur close to the Bay. And the San Francisco yellowthroat doesn't migrate. They stick to the Bay year-round. And the other subspecies does migrate away. And so understanding which of those 2 populations is present at CCFS could help us know whether the birds that we're dealing with are the San Francisco yellowthroat, which is a species of special concern at the state level, or if it's the Arizella population, the upland common yellowthroat, which doesn't have any special status at the state level. So speaking of dispersal and where birds go, this is a map of a lot of SFBBO's banded birds that have been resighted all across North America. And this does not include just CCFS data. This includes a significant number of California gulls and snowy plover observations. And the reason for that is trying to recapture an individual bird with only a band, with only a single band that has a 9-digit number stamped on it, is actually a really hard thing to do. We have fewer than 100 instances of our birds being captured anywhere else or other people's banded birds being caught at CCFS. So we don't get as much of that, larger geographic range distribution with bird banding alone as we might like. But there are some other techniques that we employ with snowy plovers and with California gulls that make this resighting process a lot easier. So we're going to segue a little bit out of land bird territory here. So back to this western snowy plover that has that set of 4 color combinations. You can see the 2 on each leg. Usually we band them when they are little chicks. And we only have like a 2 to 3 hour window in which we can get the chicks to put these color bands on. Because as soon as they hatch out of the egg and dry off, they're standing up and running around and ready to move on. So we have to be there right as they're all hatching. But this color combination, we have enough colors that we can make it unique to each bird. And so when we resight an individual, we can record what color combinations are on it and know when we banded it, how old that bird was, what nest it came from, and a whole host of other information, and see where that bird has been over its life. And with California gulls, we use a different kind of color band marking. We call this a field readable band. It has a 3-digit number on it and different colors for the band and the number color themselves. And so these bands are significantly easier to read than the color bands on the snowy plovers. They're much bigger, of course, it's a much bigger bird. But as long as you get those numbers and you get the color of the band, we can usually figure out which individual that bird came from. So here's a close-up of one of those bands. And so back in the late 2000s, we banded a whole bunch of California gulls with these bands. And this is the end, not the final result, but this is the result so far of where a lot of those birds have ended up. As I said, a lot of these records were California gulls just distributing north and south along the coast. So we'll get back to land birds a little bit. There are a few more whys to talk about here. And there's a lot going on with this slide, but we'll walk through it one piece at a time. There's a lot of really interesting information that this set of images captures. So one of the fundamental ideas of bird banding and of nest netting is it allows us to conduct population inventories. So we can detect presence, absence of certain species. We can get relative abundance of species, and we can get a mix of diversity. We can get an estimate of diversity of species in a given area. So in this context, if we assume that this slide represents 1 day of banding, then we caught 15 individuals of 6 species, but we can see that song sparrows make up about 1/3 of our sampled population, 5 out of 15 individuals. And this collection of species can also narrow down what time of year it might be. So normally when we're out banding, we know exactly what day it is. But from this perspective, if we're just looking at a mix of species, based on the individual birds' life histories, we can kind of identify what time of year it is. So we'll go around and I'll identify what those species are. So in the upper left, we have song sparrows. And then in the upper right, we have white-crowned sparrows. In the bottom left, we have 3 yellow warblers. And in the bottom right, we have 3 individual birds, a McGillivrays warbler, a dusky flycatcher, and a golden-crowned kinglet. And the reason that we can kind of narrow down what time of year based on this collection of birds, if we're assuming we caught them all at the same time, on the same day, is that white-crowned sparrows are not, they are wintering species. They don't stay for the breeding season. So they're here during the winter, they'll leave in the spring, come back in the fall, and then spend the winter again. Song sparrows are year-round residents. They're here all the time, so they don't help us too much. But then all of the birds on the lower half of the picture, they are all transient migrants. They only come through during spring and fall at CCFS specifically. And so there's a really short window, kind of in early to mid-April, where you get a crossover, and then again, kind of end of September, where you get a crossover of these different species types, where the wintering white-crowned sparrows are still around, and all of the transient migrants start passing through. And so this combination of birds puts us at either spring or fall within like 2 weeks of, kind of mid-April and end of September. So it's kind of interesting to think about it from that perspective as well. And in the context of migration, banding allows us to get things like arrival and departure dates. We can see when a whole suite of species show up, when the sort of peak of that species ends up moving through, and then when the final ones depart. And we can get stopover duration, how long species tend to stick around once they arrive on site. But more importantly, in the bigger picture, long-term monitoring is one of the kind of gold standards of mist netting and bird banding. This is ultimately what we want to collect. Long-term monitoring gives us insight into what's happening from year to year because we have a larger context to place any given year in. So one quick note about the numbers on the y-axis. They are what we call capture rate, which is the number of birds captured per 100 net hours. And so I mentioned that we have a differing number of nets that we run on each day. And I also mentioned that during certain time periods, we might have to close some nets early or delay opening. And so we can calculate, we can standardize the number of captures by the total effort or the total number of net hours that we have in order to make each year more comparable. And so once we do that, then we can know that the difference between years isn't because we opened up more nets or had nets open for longer. It really is because there were different species and different numbers of species that were moving through. So it can help separate significant trends from simple annual variation, looking at the long-term data set. And it also, having this bigger picture, helps us contextualize studies of shorter duration. So we're going to cherry pick our data a little bit for a minute, just as an example. So if we only look at the first 10 years of this data set, it seems like it's relatively stable with the exception of a couple outliers. There's not a very significant, strong downward trend as we saw with the full data set. And if we look at the last 10 years of the data set, there's a lot more variation in this time period, but things seem relatively stable as well. There isn't a strong upward or downward trend. So just sampling in those two different time periods would give us very different results. They'd both say, well, the birds are relatively stable. But in one instance, we had close to 4 birds per 100 net hours. And in the other instance, we were close to 2 birds per 100 net hours. So it doesn't seem like a lot. It's only 2 birds, difference, but that's a 50% difference. And when you have such a large data set, that's a significant amount. And then if we look at that middle section and only look at that middle 10 years, we have yet again, just a completely different story here. Just a huge amount of decline in the capture rates over that 10-year period. And so if we only sampled during that period, our message would be significantly dire. We'd be losing, all of our birds would be disappearing. And, in the bigger picture, that is a big problem. Neotropical migrants are declining across North America. But having the whole picture gives us a little bit more context and allows us to see, okay, their populations are declining. There may be a little bit of stabilization at a lower amount. So we still need to be concerned, but maybe not quite as dramatic as this instance here. So just to go through some quick results before the end of my time here. So every year we band approximately 10,000 net hours, and we catch anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 birds. And this graph is broken up between new birds and recaptured birds, new birds in blue and recaptured birds in yellow. Recaptured birds are birds that we get in the net that already have a band. And in this case, a single individual that we catch multiple times throughout the year is still included in each capture instance. And then if we look at overall capture rates broken out across that 20-year time frame from 1996 to 2015, we can see that new captures, birds that come in that don't have band, are declining at a significant rate across that time period. Whereas recaptured birds, birds that already have a band on them, are relatively stable, and the number of recaptures we get in any given year doesn't change that much. And when you combine the two together, it's still a significant decline, but it's predominantly influenced by the new captures. And looking at species richness is another way that we can get a sense of what's going on. Species richness is just the number of birds that come into the field station in any given year. So early in the mid 1990s, towards the end of the 90s, we were getting 65 to 70 species. And in the early 2010s, we were down to 55 to 60 species in any given year. So almost 20 fewer species, 15 to 20 fewer species across that time period. You can see just in the last couple years, there is a little bit of an increase here that seems to be relatively steady. And so having that long-term data is really important to understand what's going to happen with that trend. Is it going to go back up to what it used to be in the 90s, or is it going to crash again and continue its decline? And so that's why we're out there banding. It's really important for us to continue these long-term data sets and continue collecting data over this long period of time so we can understand what's going on with birds. We have a baseline data point to know if something happens, if something changes in the future, why that change happened, and whether or not it's extreme compared to what historically has been going on. And so I should thank the Santa Clara Valley Water District. We are allowed onto the property through an easement access permit through them. And I'd also like to thank just our countless number of volunteers, banders, extractors, patrollers, data enterers, data proofers that contribute thousands and thousands of hours to our banding operations. We really couldn't do it without all of our volunteers. And then we also couldn't do it without all of the support from you guys, our SFPBO members. CCFS is mostly unfunded, and so all of the support, all of the donations that you provide to us help keep us running. So we really appreciate that. So thank you all so much. And Serena, I'll let you take it back from here.
Somebody had asked where, do you have specific techniques for how to hold birds depending on their size?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Obviously with the small land birds that we typically catch in mist nets, holding them in the grips that were in the photos works really well. But we sometimes will catch much larger birds in our nets. We've caught red-tailed hawks, red-shouldered hawks. We've even caught a black-crowned night heron in our nets before. And those require significantly different handling techniques, because not only are they a lot more dangerous, raptors with their really sharp talons and black-crowned night herons with their dagger bills that can poke your eye out, but they usually require two hands to manage. So yeah, there's a lot of different techniques that we have to be familiar with, and with those larger birds, we don't always get the opportunity to practice. So it can be a little bit of a scary experience for a newer bander who hasn't had the opportunity to handle a raptor to suddenly come across one in a net. And that's why it's important for us to have a bunch of people out there as reinforcement. So if somebody is not experienced with a given technique, we can send somebody else around to help them out.
But the next question is from Pete. He asked, do you know from recaptures how long migrating birds typically stay in the spring? Are they here one day, gone the next? And is there any way for you to know whether a yellow warbler you band is going to stay or move on?
So for the first part of that question, on average, a migrant will stay about 2 weeks in a given habitat. Typically, the migrant birds will make these migratory leaps where they kind of go from one habitat to the next, spend a little bit of time refueling, foraging, and fattening back up, and then take another leap. And these leaps can be, several hundred miles long. So they'll expend all of their fat deposits that they just built up, and then they'll come back down and they'll land again and refuel again. And it does tend to be about 2 weeks long for that stopover duration. And then for the second part of that question, there are some cues that we can use to know whether a bird is going to immediately take off or whether it's likely to stick around. And that has to do with the amount of fat that the bird has built up on it. One of the measurements that we take is looking at the fat deposits, ranking the fat deposits on a scale. And if it's very, very low fat, then that bird's going to stick around. It's not going anywhere because it needs to refuel before it takes its next leap. Whereas if it's just kind of, we look at the bird and it's chock full of fat, that bird's about to go. You know, it might even take off and just leave right from our hands because it has enough fuel available to sustain it for its next flight. But from a different perspective for that second part of the question, for birds that migrate and arrive and breed at the field station or in the Bay Area, we can't differentiate a bird that's going to stay and breed versus a bird that's going to stay and just refuel and then continue moving on. So that then comes down to looking at recaptures and seeing if we get that individual bird time and time again throughout the summer.
Malcolm asked, when you band a bird, how do you adjust for the amount the bird will grow? And Maureen had answered that the width of the legs don't really grow after the first few weeks. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And thanks for that response. And yeah, after the bird hatches out of the egg, it has a short period of time where the leg will change in size, but it is very short on the matter of weeks at the most. A lot of the passerines that we deal with, they are in the nest after they hatch for up to maybe 3 weeks, some slightly shorter than that. And so they have to be able to have their legs available to perch and to run around on the ground very quickly. So usually, well, depending on the species, usually within 1 to 3 weeks, we can put a band on a bird that just hatched out of the egg, like the snowy plovers, and we don't have to worry about the leg changing in size from that point.
Maureen asked, where is the creek in the photo? And that's in reference to that satellite image where you showed where the different nets were.
The creek in the photo where I had at least all the nets kind of arrayed out, it's on the eastern side of the netting area, on the right side of the netting area. There's just a little curve of the edge of the mature riparian habitat, and it's bounded by a gray trail. So it's pretty much entirely covered by the riparian forest, so that's why it's hard to see in the image.
Cassie asked, what times of the year do you set out the nets? And Iway said all year long, 3 times a week. Is there anything else you want to add?
Nope, yep, we band year round.
Laura asked, what do different colors of bands represent? And you touched on that a little bit with the snowy plovers, but if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, the individual colors themselves don't have any meaning, at least not in the way that we use them. They purely, the combination of those 4 colors represents that individual bird. So we won't put that combination of colors out for any other birds, like the snowy plovers, until enough time has passed that either the bird, either we've confirmed the bird is dead or enough time has passed without seeing that bird that we can be sure that that color combination, if we put another one out, that's the same color combination, that it won't conflict with the different individual. So the individual colors by themselves don't mean anything, but in combination, that combination is what's important.
T. Snyder asked, does CCFS catch accipiters occasionally? And Catherine did say yes, occasionally, and usually as they chase prey into nets. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, mostly we do have to be careful of, we have to be on the lookout for accipiters. So part of our volunteer contingent are what we call predator patrollers. And in fact, all of the different levels of volunteers will actively patrol the nets. And that involves kind of patrolling, walking back and forth, keeping an eye out for potential predators, which include accipiters. And so we do catch them. We'll catch maybe 1 to 2 Sharpies in any given year, and maybe 1 Cooper's hawk every 2 to 3 years. They're not as common, but we do get them.
Maureen asked, why isn't it 40 versus 20 birds per hour? And this is in reference to the chart where you showed the number of birds caught per 100 net hours. So I guess the question is, why isn't it per hour as opposed to 100 net hours or something like that?
40 versus 20.
Yeah, I think you were saying 4 birds per hour versus 2 birds per hour. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, if we had divided by 10 net hours instead, then our numbers would seem a lot higher. 100 net hours is kind of a standard, that's just a standard metric that's used across a lot of, in a lot of banding analyses, but really it's just a standardization. It doesn't matter. We could divide by 1,000 net hours or 10,000 net hours and we'd have much smaller numbers, but it would be the same comparison.
Linda asked, do you share data with Point Blue banding station?
Yeah, we've collaborated with Point Blue on a variety of different projects. We've had grad students that have worked between our 2 facilities. Back in 2013, I believe, we had a grad student, Allison Nelson, who was putting tags on hermit thrushes, and she tagged some hermit thrushes up at Point Blue, and she tagged some down at the field station. And that was a really cool project to collaborate with them on. She ended up looking at where those hermit thrushes migrated to breed during the summer, and was using a special sort of tag that would record light levels, which would then allow her to get approximate GPS coordinates.
Yeah, and actually, if you're following us on social media, Allison Nelson is our Ask a Scientist guest this week. So if you want to read more about her hermit thrush work, you can find that on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Jumana, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, asked, what is the reason for choosing Coyote Creek as the banding site?
That's a very good question. So one thing that I didn't show, we started banding along the Coyote Creek back in the early 80s, and it was there wasn't all of that extra riparian restoration at the time, and so they banded much farther north and much farther south than where we are located today. So they would go almost to the mouth of the Coyote Creek where it dumps into the bay, and they went several kilometers down inland into San Jose. And so creek corridors have always been of particular interest. Riparian habitats tend to hold a significantly larger volume and number of species and diversity of species. And so people have focused a lot of efforts on studying riparian corridors. And so initially, the early efforts were led by San Jose State University. And so Coyote Creek is really close to there. And so that's one of the reasons that they targeted that. But then over time, as the flood control mitigation restorations happened, we kind of standardized down to the one area that we're in now to look at those different habitats over time.
Jan asked, can I come visit the field station?
That's a really good question. We do public banding demos every once in a while, a few times a year. We do a lot of banding demos for universities and for groups that are associated with other nonprofits, but we will have publicly available demos periodically. Right now, in light of all the coronavirus pandemic shelter in place, I don't think that's going to happen anytime in the near future. But keep an eye out on our website. When we do start opening that back up, we'll certainly advertise it.
T. Snyder asked, have you caught any raptors that were banded at Golden Gate Raptor Observatory?
Yes, actually we have. Just a few years ago, I think it was 2016, we caught a red-tailed hawk that had already been banded, and we contacted Golden Gate Raptor Observatory, and it was one of theirs. I can't remember. I think it was a young female that they had just banded that year. But it was neat to make that connection point from where it was originally banded, just, not even 100 kilometers away, to Coyote Creek where it is now, or where it was at that point. At this point, I have no idea where it's gone, but.
Oh, cool. Steve asked, when do you train volunteers to band?
Let's see. So training is kind of a year-round ongoing process. So I mentioned that we have that predator patrol status. So we'll start everybody off as a predator patroller, give them a few banding days to kind of get acclimated to our processes. We only ask our volunteers to come out twice a month. So a few banding days translates to about 3 months. And then we'll start training them on extraction and handling. And that section of the training can last up to like 1 to 2 years, depending on how quickly and how comfortable the volunteer is with handling birds. And then at that point, once they're proficient extracting, then we'll transition them into bander training. And from that point, it's another, maybe 2 to 3 years of training, depending on, again, how quickly they pick it up. And each time that volunteer comes out to the field station, we'll try and get a little bit of training in. So it's just a very slow, gradual process. It's good to do it that way to make sure that everybody's comfortable with the different handling skills that they need, since you are handling a live bird. We don't want to throw somebody out into the field and say, okay, have fun, and not have given them enough support and enough training that they will be comfortable doing that.
Jay asked, what type of material is used to make the bands?
The bands are all made out of aluminum, with the exception of some larger sizes that are meant for raptors and for bigger birds that have stronger bills. Those are made out of steel. But all of the bands, pretty much all of the bands that we use at the field station are lightweight aluminum.
Savannah asked, is the 5-hour band standard across all banding stations?
Actually, it isn't. Most banding stations will operate for 6 hours, and I actually don't know the history of why we cut it off at 5. It does, at least in the summer, it does tend to get a little bit hot as we get into the afternoons, and it's possible that in the early days, they were looking at their capture rates in that last hour and realized that maybe they weren't catching quite as many birds as the first, several hours. And so then just dropped that last hour. But yeah, a lot of other banding stations will go for 6 hours.
Malcolm asked, is the location where you band on Coyote Creek, is it tidal at all there, like in king tides?
Yeah, the water in the Coyote Creek where we are is a tiny bit brackish. It's mostly, it's significantly more fresh than if you just go down a kilometer. But so the creek itself is tidal, but it's not a significant tidal influence. Linda
asked, do you band in the same area as the bat banding program?
Yeah, Dave Johnston, he does band his bats out in the CCFS banding area. And I can't remember if he uses the same poles in some instances. It's a different style of net. But yeah, he'll go down into our net lanes and he'll set up bat nets out there.
And it looks like our last question for now is from Linda. She asks, do you catch more birds in early in the morning?
That depends on the time of year, actually. Generally, you would think that yes, morning would always be better than kind of later. because birds tend to be really active around sunrise, and then as the morning progresses and it heats up, they tend to settle down. But during migration, we can have really, really slow mornings where all the birds have left the previous day and nothing had arrived until a few hours into the day, and then we start getting hit with all the new arrivals. And so there are some times of the year where later in the morning is actually much busier than earlier. But I think in general, mornings do tend to be more productive.
Okay, great. I think that was our last question. Martha added that the BAT program uses the Sunday net area, but sets nets across the creek on its own poles. But anyway, so if anyone else thinks of any burning questions later on, feel free to email those to me and I'm happy to pass those on to Josh. Lots of people have said thank you and that they've really enjoyed the talk. So thank you, Josh. And is there anything else you want to add?
Thank you all so much for tuning in. Really appreciate your interest and support for SFVBO.